Is there in contemporary culture a practice as dangerous as bloodletting, but assumed to be just as scientific as bloodletting was back in the day? Like, what dangers have we become immune to in our society? I'm going to share my example here in a minute, but first, let's talk about this pre-modern medicine analogy. It's worth noting that what made this so dangerous for thousands of years, that is to say, people exposing themselves to risk that were greater than their sickness in part because they trusted the experts, wasn't that this process was unscientific, but that it was unscientific and assumed to be scientific. The scientific method isn't one that is free from errors. Rather, it's a method that seeks out errors and then tries to minimize them as a way to progress. But any sort of scientific claiming method that doesn't allow criticisms or feedback loops moves from the realm of science to dogma, doubling down on ideologies and not allowing for critique. Now, Wes Marshall, in his book Killed by a Traffic Engineer, brings up the modern equivalent to bloodletting. He draws the parallel between this and cars and traffic safety. And to exemplify this, he brings up the Vietnam War, something we all think of as a tragedy. 58,000 US soldiers died, many of them unwillingly. But during that same time period, nearly 1 million people died from motor vehicle accidents. And that number is significant, not just because it's so much greater than the 58,000, because that number represents more than all US fatalities in war combined, going back to the Revolution. And though that was one of the worst decades for car crashes, we're seeing an increase in numbers trending towards those numbers, with up to 43,000 people a year dying in cars in America. Now, why does someone like Wes Marshall think this is similar to something like bloodletting back in the day? In part because it's a problem that's already been solved in other parts of the world. And instead of following the data and some sort of scientific method of thesis, hypothesis, and experimentation, we're doubling down on outdated manuals that have presuppositions based not in knowledge, but in the ideologies of the 1940s and 50s. That is to say, there's publicly available data where I can recognize the most dangerous intersections in our city. I could pair those intersections with experiments that were done in other cities around the world and then start changing those intersections and making them safer today. And my city doesn't do that, large and in part because we are more focused on following a traffic manual that will protect us from liability than we are for protecting our own citizens. Other cities across the United States, like Jersey City, Hoboken, New Jersey, have achieved Vision Zero, where 0 traffic-related fatalities on their city streets for an entire calendar year. In fact, I think Hoboken is on year 8. They've done so in part by not following the manual to the T. That is to say, a lot of the cities that are saving lives are also breaking rules to do so. It's unfortunate that the genius in the marketing of this cover and the title of this book is also going to turn off a lot of the people that need to read it and hear it. Because I wholeheartedly believe that a lot of doctors that killed people as a result of their practices were well-meaning and thought that the best way to become a good doctor was to adhere to what they were taught in their apprenticeship. In reality, medicine started advancing when people started throwing things into question. And I believe the same thing needs to happen with traffic engineers.